He understands my trauma. Or at least that's what he told me every time he leaned across the table, his hand on mine, those dark eyes searching me like I was the only broken thing worth fixing. And for a while I believed him. I believed that someone could finally see the cracks in me without wanting to run. But then again, maybe I was so desperate to be seen that I mistook his nods and sighs for empathy, when really he was collecting pieces of me like souvenirs to use later. Because tell me, what kind of man listens to you cry about being taken advantage of? About how people exploit your softness and then turns around and books flights, hotels, and boutiques in your name with that same story. She's been through so much, he would whisper, a practiced tremor in his voice, and suddenly doors opened. Suddenly there was champagne and buckets of ice, satin bags stuffed with lingerie, and receipts that read like a diary of indulgence. My trauma repackaged as his golden ticket. It started small, the way all these things do. At first it was him asking me to explain, to tell him the whole story of where it hurt. He made it feel like therapy, like I was exhaling poison I'd kept trapped in my chest for years. He'd tilt his head, lower his voice, and say, "No, I want to understand, really understand." And when I finally let the words stumble out, when I told him about the nights that carved scars into me, he didn't flinch. He just squeezed my hand and said, "You're so strong." Those words, it's embarrassing how much they mattered. They wrapped around me like bandages, and I let them. But then came the shift. The first time I noticed it, we were sitting at this rooftop bar, the kind where everyone pretends not to be watching everyone else. He ordered cocktails I couldn't pronounce, and when the bill came, he smiled at the waiter, leaned back in his chair, and said, "She's been through hell, you know. I just wanted to do something nice for her tonight." The waiter, caught between pity and politeness, nodded and slipped the bill away like magic. I didn't even notice until later that the drinks had been comped. That night he kissed my forehead and said, "See, the world wants to give back to you." But what I didn't realize then was that the world wasn't giving back to me. It was giving to him, and he was cashing in on the currency of my pain. I want you to picture it with me, because I can still see it so clearly. The glossy hotel lobby where he spun some half-story about me needing a safe space after everything she's endured. The concierge moved to generosity, upgraded our room to a suite, or the lingerie store where he wrapped his arm around me, his voice low as he told the saleswoman, "She deserves to feel beautiful after what she's survived." I should have recognized the way her eyes softened, the way she folded silk into bags without mentioning price tags. But I did. I was too busy drowning in the strange mix of shame and validation. Shame because part of me knew I was being paraded around as someone fragile, someone to be pitied. Validation because another part of me, God help me, wanted to believe that maybe I did deserve it, that maybe surviving did earn me some kind of reward. But let me tell you where it started to unravel. One afternoon I found an email open on his laptop. He'd forgotten to close it when he went to shower. The subject line was simple: proposal for sponsorship. My curiosity got the better of me, and I read. In the email he wasn't just sharing my story, he was selling it. Every word I had trusted him with, every tear I thought was sacred, he had packaged into paragraphs dripping with pathos. He called me his partner in healing, his resilient muse, and pitched us as some kind of He asked for comped flights, resort stays, even intimate apparel partnerships because, as he wrote, she's rebuilding her sense of self, and nothing speaks to empowerment like feeling desired. Do you see it? My trauma was his marketing campaign. My scars were his strategy.
I remember sitting there staring at the screen, my stomach turning in slow, bitter circles. And the worst part wasn't even the betrayal, it was the realization that I had let it happen, that I had been so desperate to feel understood. I handed him the script and watched him turn it into a performance. He wasn't understanding my trauma, he was monetizing it. I confronted him, of course. You'd think he'd stumble, stutter, backtrack. But no, he smiled. He smiled at me with that infuriating calm and said, "Babe, this is for us. Don't you see, this is how we build a life. Your story inspires people. It makes them want to give." He leaned closer, his hand brushing my cheek. "You've been hurt enough. Let the world take care of you now. Let me take care of you." That line, it could have been romantic in another life. But here, it was a blade, because he wasn't taking care of me. He was feeding himself, wrapping his greed in the language of love and calling it destiny. I didn't know what to say that night. I didn't leave right away. That's the truth. I sat there, silent, while he poured wine and painted pictures of all the things we could have if I just let him keep playing the part. Trips to Paris, weekends in Bali, closets filled with silk and lace. He made it sound like a fairy tale, like a reward for surviving the darkness. And part of me wanted to believe it. Because isn't that what we all want, to believe that our suffering will be worth something? That there's a prize at the end of pain. But here's the thing about pain. It doesn't turn into currency. It doesn't make anyone rich. Not unless they're the kind of person willing to use it as a prop. And once I saw that clearly, once I saw the way he rehearsed my lines for other people, I couldn't unsee. I started noticing every little moment where he slipped my story into conversation, like a card trick he was proud of. Every time he said she's been through so much, I could hear the unspoken follow-up. So what will you give us? I'll stop here for now because this is just the beginning. The unraveling was slow, messy, and so much worse than I can capture in one breath. But remember this, when someone says, I understand your trauma, listen carefully to what they do with that understanding. Do they hold it gently, guard it like something sacred, or do they parade it around, polishing it into a tool for their own gain? Because sometimes the biggest betrayal isn't when someone fails to see your scars. It's when they see them too clearly and decide they're worth exploiting. Part 2 begins with the sound of laughter. Not my laughter, his. That kind of laughter that's just a little too loud, little too self-satisfied. The kind that fills a room because it needs everyone inside it to turn and look. I remember standing there, tucked into the corner of a boutique hotel suite he'd secured for us, watching him hold court with 2 men I didn't know. He was pouring whiskey, retelling my story as though it belonged to him. She's been through things you wouldn't believe, he said, voice dipped in solemnity for effect. Then he chuckled, like it was all some incredible twist of fate that I'd ended up by his side. The men nodded, leaned in, and one of them slapped him on the back. I felt my throat tighten, not from anger yet, but from that slow creeping recognition that I wasn't the person he was protecting. I was the product he was selling.
It's strange how you can see something so clearly in hindsight, but miss it in the moment. Back then, I kept telling myself that maybe he didn't mean it the way it sounded. Maybe he was just proud of me, proud of us, proud of the way we'd risen from the ashes. That's what he always called it. He'd grab my hands and say, "We're phoenixes, babe, rising together." Except it wasn't together, was it? It was him rising on the wings of a story he didn't earn, wings he stitched together with the feathers of my pain. And when I started realizing that, really realizing it, I began to notice all the details I'd ignored. The way he'd always nudge me to share more in public. The way he'd angle his phone just right when I was crying so that my face, raw and vulnerable, could become part of some curated narrative he was building. The breaking point came during a trip to Italy, Venice, of all places. He told me it was a gift, a surprise getaway to remind me that life could be beautiful again. We stayed in a hotel overlooking the canals, the kind of view that makes postcards jealous. And for a brief moment I let myself breathe. I let myself imagine that maybe, just maybe, he was right. That maybe this was healing. But then one evening, as I returned from walking alone through the narrow alleys, I found him on the balcony, his phone on speaker. He was talking to a brand manager. I froze when I heard my name. "Her backstory is perfect for your campaign," he said, his tone businesslike, clipped. "She survived trauma. She's resilient. She's finding her beauty again. Pair that with your lingerie line. And it's not just marketing, it's empowerment." I can still feel the way the blood drained from my face, how my stomach knotted until I thought I'd be sick. I wasn't his partner. I wasn't even his girlfriend in that moment. I was a pitch deck, a campaign asset, a sob story tied up with lace. He hung up, grinning, and when he saw me standing there he didn't even flinch. He just held his arms out and said, "Surprise, babe. I'm building our future. Do you know what's worse than being betrayed? It's being betrayed so casually, so confidently that the other person doesn't even think it's betrayal." To him this wasn't exploitation. It was opportunity. He kissed my forehead, told me I'd thank him one day, and went right back to his email. That night, lying beside him in a bed that suddenly felt like a stranger's, I stared at the ceiling and realized how far I'd let myself fall into his story. He had convinced me that my trauma could be transformed into treasure, that letting him spin it into silk and champagne was somehow justice for all the nights I'd cried alone. And I had wanted to believe it, because it's easier to let someone else tell you that your pain has purpose than to sit with the possibility that maybe it doesn't. After Venice, I started watching him like you watch a magician. Once you know the trick, his charm, his easy way with words, his ability to turn every situation into a stage. It wasn't for me, it was for them, the waiters, the managers, the strangers who opened doors and offered upgrades. He'd lean in close, lower his voice, and the words would spill out like rehearsed lines. "She's been through so much. She deserves this. I just want to give her the world." And every time someone else would reach for their wallet, their pen, their keycard, he didn't pay for love. He brokered it with my wounds. The lingerie arrived first,
Boxes, wrapped in tissue paper with notes that read things like, "For her continued journey of empowerment." He'd grin as he tore them open, tossing satin and lace onto the bed as though it were treasure, plundered from some noble conquest. "See," he'd say, "they believe in us." Then came the trips, resorts in Bali, weekends in New York, spa retreats that came with champagne and hashtag. And through it all, he kept reminding me,
This is for you. This is because of you. But it wasn't because of me. It was because of what I'd endured and the way he'd learned to package it for profit. I started pulling back. At dinners, I stopped sharing. At parties, I went quiet. He noticed, of course. He always noticed. One night, when the silence between us felt like it might split the room in half, he turned to me and said, "What happened to you? You used to be so open, so vulnerable. That's what made people love us. Us, not me. Us." And it hit me like a punch to the chest. He wasn't mourning my silence because he missed knowing me. He was mourning it because it made me harder to sell. It's not easy to admit how long I stayed, how many times I swallowed my pride and told myself it wasn't that bad. He was giving me experiences I'd never had before, wasn't he? He was showing me the world, dressing me in silk, filling my life with stories I'd never imagined. And there was a twisted part of me that thought maybe I should be grateful. Maybe this was the closest thing to healing I was going to get. But healing doesn't come wrapped in lingerie or poured into champagne flutes. Healing doesn't demand an audience. Healing doesn't make you a commodity. The real turning point came in New York. He had organized some lavish dinner at a restaurant that looked like it had been carved out of gold. Halfway through the evening, after yet another round of introductions where I was paraded as the survivor who inspires him, I excused myself and slipped into the bathroom, and there, standing in front of the mirror in a dress he'd chosen, wearing jewelry gifted not to me but to the image of me he'd created, I didn't recognize the woman staring back. She looked polished, expensive, desirable, but she wasn't. She was a mannequin draped in trauma, a puppet whose strings were pulled by the man waiting at that table. I pressed my hands against the sink and whispered to myself, "This isn't love." It was the first time I'd said it out loud, and once I did, the weight of it nearly crushed me. But it also freed me just a little, because love doesn't exploit. Love doesn't turn your scars into sales pitches. Love doesn't make you feel like a guest star in your own life. When I walked back out, he was already laughing again, already filling glasses and telling stories that weren't his to tell, and I knew then, as surely as I've ever known anything, that I couldn't keep living as his currency. The unraveling had started, and no amount of silk or champagne was going to stitch it back together. That's where part 2 ends. The realization, the crack in the glass, the quiet moment in the mirror when I finally saw the truth. Part 3 is where everything broke open, where the mask slipped off completely, and I had to decide what kind of life I was willing to live. The one he built out of my trauma, or the one I would finally build for myself. Part 3 began not with shouting, not with a dramatic breakup scene in a hotel lobby, but with silence, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like it's pressing against your skin. After New York, I stopped giving him reaction. When he launched into his familiar speeches about how she's been through so much, I just stared past him. When he draped lingerie over my shoulders and said, "You deserve this," I folded it neatly back into the box. And when he laughed too loudly at dinners, when he tapped his glass to get everyone's attention before unrolling another chapter of my life to strangers, I let my face go blank. No approval, no validation, just silent. At first, he didn't notice. He was too busy playing the role he'd written for himself, the doting partner, the man who discovered treasure in someone else's ruins. But slowly my silence started to cut through the noise. He began to frown when I didn't smile on cue. He squeezed my hand harder when I didn't join the performance. And then one night he broke. We were back home, sitting on the couch with unopened boxes of gifts stacked around us. He looked at me, really looked at me, and said, "You're ruining this. Don't you see? People love us because of your story, because of what you've survived. That's why they give. That's why they help. Without that, without you, we're nothing." I felt something inside me snap. Not in anger, not in rage, but in clarity. I stood up, walked to the stack of boxes and opened one. Inside was yet another set of lace lingerie, delicate and expensive. I held it up, the fabric slipping through my fingers like water, and asked, "Do you even know what size I wear?" He blinked at me, confused, and for the first time I saw it. The gap between the image he had created and the woman standing in front of him. He didn't know.
He didn't care. I wasn't a person to him. I was a vessel, a vehicle, a character in a story that made other people open their wallet. That night, I packed a bag. Not everything, not even most things. Just enough. Clothes, documents, the little pieces of myself that still felt like mine. He tried to stop me, of course. He stood in the doorway, his voice climbing higher with every word. You're being ungrateful. Do you know how many women would kill for this? Do you know how many people want what we have? I turned to him, bag on my shoulder, and said, what we have isn't real. What we have is a performance. And I'm done playing the part. Leaving wasn't cinematic. There was no applause, no dramatic music. Just me, walking out into the night with a bag that felt heavier than it was. But I'll tell you this, it was the first time in months, maybe years, that I felt like I was carrying myself instead of being carried as a prop in someone else's show. The days after were harder than I expected. Without him, the world didn't hand me free drinks or room upgrades. There were no boxes arriving at my door. No invitations to glamorous dinner, just me, sitting in a small apartment staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out who I was without the narrative he'd built around me. And that's the part no one tells you about leaving someone like him. There's an emptiness, a silence where all the noise used to be, and you have to decide whether that silence is freedom or loneliness. For me, it was both. I missed the way he made me feel seen, even if it was only to sell the image of me. I missed the champagne nights, and the way people's eyes softened when they heard my story. But I didn't miss the cage. I didn't miss the way he twisted my trauma into a currency. I didn't miss being reduced to a punchline in someone else's pitch.
Slowly, I started reclaiming my story. I stopped telling it the way he had trained me to. I stopped using it as a hook, stopped presenting it as a tragedy that needed to be compensated. I told it to myself in the mirror, raw and unpolished. Not for pity, not for profit, but for healing. And with every retelling, it became less of a performance and more of a truth I could live with. Months later, I saw him again. It was at an event, a mutual friend's birthday. He walked in, still dressed like he owned every room he entered, still laughing too loudly, still hungry for attention. When he saw me, he froze. For a second, I thought he might try to pull me back in, try to remind me of us. But then he noticed something he hadn't seen before me, standing alone, smiling, not because of a story, not because of a gift, but because I had finally chosen myself. His grin faltered, and in that tiny shift, I realized something important. He had never really understood my trauma. He had only understood its usefulness. Now when people ask me about him, about what happened, I tell them this. He thought my scars were his ticket. He thought my pain was his stage. He thought my survival was his story to tell. But the truth is, survival doesn't belong to the person who watches it. It belongs to the one who lives it. And I lived it. I am still living it. So yes, he understood my trauma, but only enough to twist it, to exploit it, to turn it into free trips and lingerie. And me, I understand it now in a way he never will. I understand that my pain is not a currency, my healing is not a spectacle, and my story finally is mine.